welcome back to Daniel chapter 11. We're in Daniel chapter 11. I cannot believe we're almost done with our study through the book of Daniel. We've been at it now for several months. And guys, I'm telling you, it's been one of my favorite studies I think I've ever done. I'm going to be disappointed when it's over. There may be a lot you feel like you haven't understood. There's a lot I don't understand. If it makes you feel any better, there's a lot Daniel didn't understand. In fact, I want to remind you of something God told him at the end of this chapter 12, at the end of this prophecy. He said these words in Daniel 12, verse 8. It says, although I heard, I did not understand. So if you sometimes wonder if there's something wrong with you because you don't fully understand, well, Daniel didn't either. It's not you. Look at what it says. Then I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Now, what is remarkable about it, as we get closer and closer to the end, the time of the end, more and more of this prophecy is being revealed. It's being unsealed. But there's still more that we can't fully understand because it's not yet all the way to the end. But as I've shared over and over again, our study of the book of Daniel, we're seeing more and more of the pieces of the puzzle coming together, even in our lifetime, even, I'm convinced, in the 21st century, things that Daniel saw 2,500 years ago in the 5th century BC as he prophesied from Babylon in captivity. Now, I want to remind you of something we've shared. Understanding biblical prophecy is only possible as you study history. The future is always connected to the past. And so many people don't understand the book of Daniel because there's so much prophecy. But the reason they don't understand any prophecy is they don't know anything about history. And so Daniel chapter 11 gives us a lot of history, but it connects us to the future, I'm convinced, of things that will happen maybe even in the 21st century. You can't understand the future unless you peer into the past. And today we're going to peer into the past to look into the future. We're going back to the future. One of the iconic films of the 80s. And of course, this is a time, it seems like everywhere I go, they're playing 80s music. And even my kids are watching 80s movies, and none of them may be more iconic than Back to the Future. You know what? God gives us a chance to go back to the future for real. And that's what the study of biblical prophecy is. As you go back, God takes you into the future. And Daniel chapter 11 does that for us. Now, it's an enormous chapter, which means I'm going to just do really a quick flyover. I'm going to give you kind of the highlight reel. I won't have time to come down at really in-depth level like we have in several places through the study of the book of Daniel, or we honestly could be here until the millennial kingdom, and none of us really want to be here until the millennial kingdom. We got other things to do to prepare for Jesus before he comes and simply study the book of Daniel. But I do want you to give kind of an idea of what's going on in the book of Daniel chapter 11. Scripture, God often gives us historical events as foreshadows to future events. Daniel chapter 11 is no different. What you have here is the history of the wars that go on for generations after the death of Alexander the Great. Now, what's remarkable is Daniel is prophesying this 200 or 300 years before any of these events would happen. And what happens is, historically, it happens exactly the way Daniel prophesies 200 or 300 years before any of it would happen. But it's not just history. As I've shared, lots and lots of prophecy has a dual fulfillment, meaning there's a partial historical fulfillment that foreshadows a future and final fulfillment. Daniel chapter 11 is just like that. There's a partial historical fulfillment that we're going to talk about that simply paints a picture prophetically of something that's going to happen in the future that is yet the final fulfillment then of these prophecies. Verses 1 through 20 contain a prophecy regarding a series of wars between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms. Remember, when Alexander the Great dies, his kingdom is divided 4 ways among his 4 generals. They fought it out. And after about 20 years of civil war, they came to a truce and they divided up the map and decided who got what. Well, their descendants, generations later, would continue those individual kingdoms, and they would continue fighting one with another. And several centuries ahead of time, Daniel prophesies that very thing. Now it's history, but remember, it's a picture prophetically of something future yet. These verses detail over 150 years of wars between two of Alexander the Great's generals and their descendants. And that's what we're about to read. Because we don't have much of a sense of this part of history, you can read this and not really understand what's going on. But I promise, if we were to take maybe, let's just say an Encyclopedia Britannica, when they still had encyclopedias, and we were to take an overlay of this time of history and we were laying it over Daniel chapter 11, I'm telling you, it would fit absolutely perfectly. As Daniel details, 300 years before any of this happens, over 150 years of wars that will take place between these two kingdoms. Daniel 11:3, let's pick it up right here. Here we go. It says, "Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." Let's pick it up, back up with me and go to Daniel chapter 11. Let's just pick it up here in verse 1 instead of picking it up in verse 3, and then we'll move forward, okay? So it says this, "Also, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood up to confirm and strengthen him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than them all by his strength. Through his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece." So Daniel here is prophesying that 4 kings after the first king, Darius, there's a king that's going to stir up Greece against them. And this has to do with the Persian-Grecian wars that happened exactly as Daniel prophesied it would. There's a 4th king, very powerful, very wealthy, far more rich and influential than even the kings before him. And that Persian king is going to go to war with Greece. But then in verse 3, Daniel prophesies a Grecian king that will one day emerge to overcome the kings of Persia. Then a mighty king, this is going to be Alexander the Great, shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he is risen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity. And once again, it's remarkable. Daniel prophesies this centuries before it happens. We know now, and you've heard me say in other chapters, because Alexander the Great and Grecian kingdom carries so much space within the book of Daniel. You know by now that when Alexander dies at the height of his power, at the height of his strength, he has no posterity to pass on his kingdom to. It's divided 4 ways among his 4 generals. In fact, we know historically it was indeed divided to the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity. He had no living heirs. His only son was born, we would say today, with special needs. Probably, we don't know for sure, probably had maybe Down syndrome, maybe he was autistic, but we know he had a little boy that was special needs in some ways, how we'd put it today. And the poor kid was murdered after Alexander died. They wanted to make sure that he had no living heir of the kingdom. And then indeed, the kingdom was split 4 ways, not by his posterity, but by his generals. "Nor according to his dominion with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides thee." This prophecy is now history. It really happened. You can read all about this and Wikipedia. You can read about it anywhere on the internet. Google Alexander, Google his kingdom, Google the 4 generals. It's all there. It's remarkable. People will say, well, nobody could have done this ahead of time. And what is remarkable, how many people are convinced Daniel has to be a fraud, this book has to be a forgery, because nobody could have known all of this ahead of time with such detail and precision. But you understand that Jesus called Daniel a prophet. So if you're going to throw away the book of Daniel, you got to throw away Jesus, which, let's face it, is the real issue with most modern skeptics and would-be scholars. They do not want to believe in the authority of the Bible. not because the Bible contradicts itself, but because the Bible contradicts them. Instead of lining them up behind Scripture, they want to take Scripture and cut and paste it so it lines up behind them. Now, there's several reasons historically, just from a bibliographic scholastic test, that I'm convinced Daniel is the real deal. But the number one reason I'm convinced he's the real deal is Jesus made it clear. He spoke of Daniel, the prophet. Here you have a man that receives information ahead of time. It's prophecy in his day. Now we can look behind us through the lens of history, and we can see how it happened specifically the way he promised. And what you have here are two generals that are going to go to war, of the four generals, specifically Ptolemy and Seleucus. In Daniel chapter 11 describes the series of wars between these two men and their descendants. Two of those four generals was Ptolemy, who took Egypt, and Seleucus, that took Syria and Mesopotamia. And notice the country that sits in the middle of those two kingdoms. That's right, Israel had the misfortune of kind of joining those two kingdoms together, which is why Israel, for the next 150 years, would have the misfortune of being a battlefield. As these two men and the generations of kings that would follow them would fight continually over land, over real estate. And often their armies would meet in the middle, which was in fact, not so coincidentally, but providentially, the land of Israel. Because remember, what we're about to read is the maneuvering of these two militaries as they would fight each other for power, for influence, for glory, for real estate, for wealth. But it's also a prophetic foreshadow, I'm convinced, of the maneuvering of the armies that eventually converge in that same land of Israel in the valley of Armageddon. That's right, at the end of the tribulation. Now, I want you to see these verses. They're future narrative also, not just a historical narrative, but a future narrative of the political and military maneuvering during the tribulation leading up then to the battle of Armageddon. And in some way, what you're seeing is the future as we go back in history to understand something about the future leading up to the infamous battle of Armageddon. Daniel 11:5. Also the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And at the end of some years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of her authority. And so what you're seeing here is the political maneuvering and the political alliance building that went on historically in the ancient world, as kings would build alliances by marrying off their daughter to another king. And that's how you would maybe build a peace treaty or build an alliance. Now, again, this prophecy is sealed to the time of the end. So how does this fit perfectly into the future as it relates to the Antichrist and his military forces that are going to meet many other nations' military forces in the Battle of Armageddon? We can't say with certainty, but we know that he will be a master political manipulator. He will be a master at political alliance building. It says in verse 6, and neither he nor his authority shall stand, but she shall be given up with those who bought her or brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. Now, verses 21 through 35 describe specifically a king, one of the descendants that would rule over the Seleucid kingdom. And specifically the land of Israel. We've already been introduced to him. Antiochus Epiphanes, we're introduced to him in chapter 8. And what you see now in verses 21 through 35 describe the military maneuvering and the political posturing of this one in history known as Antiochus Epiphanes, who ruled the Seleucid kingdom from 175 to 164 BC. Antiochus Epiphanes, remember, we learned this in Daniel chapter 8, is a biblical foreshadow and historical forerunner of the coming Antichrist. There's a reason why this man, Antiochus, in history, commands so much space in the book of Daniel, because he specifically, more than any other of these kings, prophetically foreshadow another king that is to come. There's so much to learn about the kingdom of the Antichrist that is yet future by studying the kingdom of Antiochus Epiphanes in the past. You can learn a lot about the rule of Antichrist by simply studying the history of this very, very cruel dictator, this very, very cruel king known as Antiochus Epiphanes. I want to give you several things to consider from Daniel chapter 11 right now as we study the cruel reign of Antiochus. First of all, he will rise to power by bringing peace and prosperity, not war. And Antiochus actually seizes power, we know historically, over the ancient land of Israel, not through warfare, but through political maneuvering and political covenants and alliance building. And this is exactly how it describes the Antichrist coming to power during the end of days. It says in Daniel 11:21, and in his place shall arise a vile person. This speaks now of Antiochus, but remember, it speaks prophetically also of the Antichrist, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. You have the Antichrist coming to power on a white horse. What is wrong with this picture? If you've been paying attention in our study recently of our end times, we've referred a number of times to the four horsemen of the apocalypse, not to be confused with the four horsemen related to the starting linemen of the Notre Dame front line of the 1930s. No, you wouldn't know that if you don't know anything about sports history. Forget it. They were the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Forget that. If you Google four horsemen of the apocalypse, you might get a picture of these four linemen from the University of Notre Dame, but that's not what we're talking about. The four horsemen of the apocalypse in Revelation chapter 6 says this related to this first horse and this white horse. Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, come and see. And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. Now, what do you see wrong with this artist's rendering? This is the problem when artists try to capture what John sees in the book of Revelation. What you have is a man here on a white horse. A white horse historically in the ancient world was indeed reserved for a conquering general, a conquering king. It says he has a bow, but he has no arrow. The implication is this man comes to power without firing a shot. He has a bow, but he has no arrows. He doesn't shoot any arrows. He comes to power through peace and prosperity. And that's exactly, we know historically, what happens with Antiochus. Initially, he's embraced by those living in ancient Israel. He promised to basically leave them alone, to let them worship their God in peace. But we know at some point he breaks that covenant exactly as the Antichrist will. Daniel 9:27, he makes a covenant for 7 years with those living in Israel, the Jews. And at the midway through the week, the 3.5-year point, he causes the sacrifices to cease. He bans the Jewish religion. He outlaws the temple sacrifices, having allowed the Jews to rebuild their temple. And he breaks the peace treaty. That's exactly what Antiochus did historically. He rises to power peacefully, but he also does it gradually through treachery and with flattery. Look at what it says in Daniel 11:32. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, speaking of that covenant that Antiochus made with the Jews, prophetically foreshadowing a covenant, the future Antiochus, the Antichrist will make with the Jews. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. What we learn there is that he will corrupt those who are in alliance with him, and he will corrupt them against those who are in this covenant with him. and he is building slowly this alliance. We know he comes to power very gradually with flattery. Here's what he does. He knows how to stroke leaders' egos. He knows exactly how to build political alliances because he knows human nature. He knows how people are built. Listen, if you have an ego, you can be easily manipulated. This is why a true leader can't be manipulated, because he knows he has an ego. He just won't listen to it. But most human beings listen to their ego, which is why somebody who's wise and knows human beings, he knows how to pull their strings. He knows how to push their buttons. So he comes to power peaceably without even firing a shot. He comes to power with political alliance building. He corrupts them against those he's made this covenant with, the Jews specifically. How does he corrupt them? It's just through flattery. He knows how to use his speech. He knows how to pull people's strings. Now, he rises to power with only a small group of people initially. Initially, his power is local before it goes global. And remember, this is all history related to Antiochus, but it also is a dual fulfillment prophecy. It's partially historically fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes, but it'll have a future and final fulfillment in another king that is yet to come. Daniel 11:22. With the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after the league is made with him, what league is in view? Remember this league of 10 nations, this 10-nation confederation. Daniel chapter 2 was reflected in the 10 toes of iron mixed with clay, that revived Roman Empire. We learned in Daniel 2, those 10 toes reflect 10 nations that are yet to come, yet to emerge. A revived Roman Empire of sorts. The legs of iron in Daniel chapter 2, speaking of the old Roman Empire, east and west, the right leg, left leg. I've said probably you've got 5 nations from Europe, 5 nations from the Arab world. The Roman Empire spanned both east and west, both the European world and the Arab world. The implication being this political power base will be a 10-nation confederation, probably 5 nations from Europe, 5 nations from the Arab world. We saw those 10 toes reflected in the 10 horns in chapter 7 of the 4th beast. And we learned clearly these are 10 kings. This is the league of nations. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. See, he doesn't begin with a league of nations, a 10-nation confederation. He probably emerges out of one nation. Out of one of those horns, Daniel 7 tells us on the 4th beast, another horn emerges. Another horn comes from up within the 10 horns. He probably rises to power with local presence and a local influence, probably out of one nation, with a small group of people, it says. So he begins with just a very local influence before he gets this global influence. And from that local influence and that one nation, he begins to build an alliance with other nations until he has this League of Nations, this 10-nation confederation. Look at number 4 then. He will submit the nations by controlling the world's oil. He is rising to power through this political alliance. So far, he hasn't fired a shot. It's been all political posturing, maneuvering, manipulating, pulling the strings of world leaders. He is a master diplomat. He is a master politician. And now that he has the League of Nations, he has the power base to really start controlling not just the 10 nations, but the entire world. He'll submit the nations by controlling the world's oil. Look at what it says in Daniel 11:24. He shall enter peaceably even into the richest places of the province. And he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. Now, here's what's interesting. Remember, he hadn't fired a shot yet. He's got a bow, but no arrows. He shall enter peaceably even into the richest places. That word richest in the Hebrew is the word oil or oily. You could literally read Daniel 11:24, he shall enter peaceably even into the oily places. He is controlling now the world's oil fields. He shall enter peaceably even into the richest places of the province. This word province in Daniel 11:24 is the Hebrew word Medina, which I don't believe is coincidental. In fact, I think that is providential, because if you know anything about geography, you know that Medina is a city in Saudi Arabia, one of the oily places in an oily province, and Medina happens to be a city that is the second most holy site in all of Islam. Now, a few weeks ago, I preached a message entitled The Rise of Islam in the Last Days. And all of a sudden, you see more of those little puzzle pieces coming together here. How would this man rise to power peaceably in what amounts to the oily places of the world? Yes, I know there's lots of places in the world that have oil. The U.S. has oil reserves that we're currently not drilling and tapping, even though we're paying over $5 a gallon for gas as I speak. There are other places that have oil, but the places that are richest in oil are, of course, the OPEC nations, the Arab nations, Saudi Arabia being one of them. And so what you have here is a man who comes to power peaceably, even in the oily places with the oil reserves in this province, not so coincidentally, translated from the word Medina. And if I'm right about what I said in that sermon, The Rise of Islam in the Last Days, it could be, this is the reason why, that the Antichrist, the biblical Antichrist, is in fact the Muslim Messiah known as the 12th Imam. He emerges on the world scene, and the Arab nations, the Muslim nations, embrace him as possibly their long-awaited 12th Imam. This is how he comes into this province peaceably. He doesn't take it through warfare. He takes it peaceably. They willingly submit to him as their leader, as he puts together this League of Nations. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches. And he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. I want you to notice he disperses among them the plunder, the spoil, and the riches. It says, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds. What he's doing here is dispersing some of the wealth among the people. He is doing what is commonly called wealth redistribution. This is partly how Antiochus won the trust initially of the Jewish people throughout the land of Israel. He redistributed some of the wealth of the Grecian Empire, and his wealth that he had, having come to power as king of the Seleucid kingdom. And this is commonly how kings come to power. And it's through that wealth redistribution. Interestingly, in a time of global economic cataclysm, there's really only three things that will have any material value: gold, silver, and oil. And at this point, he appears to command the world's oil reserves, the world's oil, which is directly related to the world's economy, which is why I'm convinced on the heels of the white horse, a man that comes to power under peace, you have the black horse that follows. Look at what it says again in Revelation 6, related to this black horse rider. It says in verse 3, when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, come and see. And another horse, this is the red horse, and another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another, and there was given to him a great sword. And when he opened the third seal, I heard a third living creature say, come and see. So I looked, behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. I want you to notice this black horse rider has a pair of scales as the artist has rendered it. And it speaks here of bartering. It speaks here of buying and selling and trading as they would do in the ancient world. And it's a black horse because it's a time of darkness and death. It is a time of famine and desperation. It says in verse 6, "And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." The implication here is this a time of runaway inflation. It is a time of hyperinflation. It is a time of global economic recession and depression. You have this voice saying a quart of wheat for a denarius. In the ancient days, a quart of wheat wasn't very much. It was basically a subsistence living. It was enough to just barely survive. A denarius, a day's wages. The implication is this is a time yet future where it's going to take a day's wages just for barely enough food to survive. But then it says, do not touch the oil and the wine. Oil and wine in the ancient days were commodities of the wealthy, commodities of the rich. And the implication being the rich and the wealthy will be just fine, but the poor are going to get even more poor. And historically, that is exactly what happens during times of great global economic cataclysm or just localized desperation and depression economically. There are those that are wealthy and stay wealthy and get more wealthy. But most people suffer deeply. What you have here is a description of what amounts to wealth redistribution. This man initially comes and appears to be the answer to those that are poor, an answer to those that are hungry and just barely have enough to feed their families. As this time of global famine and recession. Number 5, he'll subdue through his military the nations who will not submit. Here's a man that controls the world's oil fields. He's come into the richest place in the province, richest being the oily place, the oily province, Medina, Saudi Arabia specifically. He controls the oil fields, meaning he controls the world's economy. But those that will not submit for pure economic reasons, like starvation, he'll submit militarily. You begin to see why in Revelation 13, you read where they say, who is like unto the beast and who is able to make war with him. It's like he has the world at a checkmate. He's got the military power of the West, the 5-nation confederation related to the Europe side of the League of Nations. He's got the oil fields of the East related to the Arab side of that League of Nations. Imagine the power this man has now. He's got the oil, and yes, we live at a time where everybody knows we're living at the end of the age of the fossil fuels. Yes, we all know that, but let's just be honest. We're a long ways from flying airplanes with green energy. We're a long ways from driving 18-wheelers with electricity. It is still oil that drives the world's economy, specifically diesel oil. Hey, and when you think about military and modern mechanized armies, oil and diesel specifically is even more crucial. Everything is tied to the price of oil when it comes to gas and groceries. This man, you see, will destroy economies. He has the ability to destroy currencies. He can pull the chain and push the buttons as it relates to the economy. He controls the oil. But those that won't submit, he'll make war. And that's exactly what Antiochus did historically. He came in initially with peace, and he was the king that was going to allow the Jews to worship peaceably. He appeared initially to share in the prosperity, but then he breaks the covenant, and it becomes all-out war on the Jews. He does that in 167 BC, having come to power in 175 BC in some way that prophetically pictures the future. This man will subdue through his military the nations who will not submit. Look at verse 25. He shall stir up his power and discourage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yet those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And this is the red horse rider that John sees now, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. He comes to power initially peaceably, but then he hits war. It says in verse 3, when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, come and see. And another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that peace should kill one another. They should kill one another, and there was given to him a great sword. And that's what happens as he breaks this covenant with the Jews. We know it says in Matthew 24, Jesus called it the Abomination of Desolation midway through the tribulation, midway through Daniel's 70th week, Daniel 9:27. He breaks that covenant. He declares war on the Jews. And this is what Antiochus did in 167 BC. He made war on the Jews. As many as 100,000 Jews were slaughtered by Antiochus. And that is only a microcosm of the Antichrist and the Holocaust that he will unleash on the Jews. But not just the Jews, upon the entire world, upon the nations who will not submit to him, who refuse to submit to him. We know that what we're seeing in Daniel chapter 11 in some way pictures prophetically, it's a shadow of things to come as the nations of the world begin to maneuver militarily. When we talk about the Battle of Armageddon, it's not a single battle. Yes, it ends in the valley of Armageddon, the valley of Megiddo. But the reality is the last half of the tribulation, what Jesus called the Great Tribulation, will be fraught with war, world war, as the nations begin turning on the Antichrist. In fact, remember in Daniel 7, it says 3 of those 10 horns that initially appear to be his power base politically, they appear to rebel against him. And it says he uproots them, he overcomes them. Remember, those 10 horns are reflected by the 10 toes of Daniel chapter 2 of iron mixed with clay. It appears to have the strength of iron and the strength of the old Roman Empire, but the reality is that coalition is very brittle. It's actually very fragile. Iron and clay don't come together to make something very strong. It appears to be strong. The truth is that ceramic, that clay is very brittle. And that confederation begins to break up. Don't know for sure why it begins to break up, but 3 of those nations, 3 of those kings turn on the Antichrist. Now, I don't know this for sure. Again, just speculation. This prophecy is still sealed. It's only barely starting to open where it can be revealed. But if I'm right about this Islamic piece of the puzzle, and if I'm right, and I don't know for sure I am, that the biblical Antichrist is in fact the Muslim 12th Imam, then imagine what this means. Initially, those 5 nations, those Arab nations embrace him, believing he is the long-awaited 12th Imam. But what happens when he enters Jerusalem? Making war on the Jews, which is part of Muslim eschatology. They believe the 12th Imam eventually leads war on the Jews to establish an Islamic caliphate, a worldwide kingdom, and the worship of Allah as the nations are submitted to what amounts to a theocracy and the worship of Allah. Now imagine, they initially follow him believing he's the 12th Imam. But then he goes into the rebuilt Jewish temple, having broken the covenant with the Jews. He causes the sacrifices to cease, Daniel 9:27. Then he does something completely unsuspected. They could have never seen coming. 2 Thessalonians 2. He goes into the temple of God, proclaims himself to be God, sitting on the throne of God. He's now worshiped as God, Revelation 13. That would be blasphemous to many Muslims. The 12th Imam is not Allah. He's not God. He was sent to usher in the worldwide worship of God. Now this man is claiming to be God. I think maybe that's why his coalition begins to break up. And that's what you see in Daniel chapter 11. This king is now starting to look at insurrections of those that used to be in coalition. Now you have some of those nations beginning to turn on the Antichrist, and it unleashes the red horse rider as a global war begins to take over the map toward the last half of the tribulation. Now they will sit down at some point and have a peace talk, and they'll sit at the peace table and talk it over. But both sides, both kings, are going to be lying to each other. Look at what it says in Daniel 11:27. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant. And this, of course, speaks of the Daniel 9:27 covenant. Historically, it speaks of the covenant Antiochus had made with the Jews. It speaks of the future covenant. As you go back to the future, speaking of the Daniel 11:27 covenant that the Antichrist makes with the Jews. His heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land. At the appointed time, he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. You see, he will break the covenant with the Jews. And this is exactly what Antiochus did. In 167 BC, the month was December. He breaks the covenant with the Jews. He bans their religion. He had guaranteed their freedom of religion. Now he outlaws their religion. I shared a lot of this in Daniel chapter 8 already in our study of Antiochus Epiphanes. But what does he do? He sets up an altar to Zeus in the Holy of Holies. He commands that Jews worship the image of Zeus under penalty of death. Tens of thousands of them won't. Tens of thousands of them die. He takes a sow hog, an unclean animal, an abomination to the Jews. He slays that hog in the Holy of Holies. And he takes the blood of that hog and he splatters it all over the sanctuary in the Holy of Holies, completely desecrating the most holy site in all of Judaism. Jesus spoke of this in Matthew 24 as the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. What will this future Antiochus do? He himself will claim to be Epiphanes, a title Antiochus Epiphanes gave himself. Antiochus, God manifest. Epiphanes, God manifest. He was claiming to be God manifest. At the midway point through the tribulation, what happens? A man claims to be God manifest. He sets up an image, the false prophet, of this man, an image of the beast, not an image of Zeus, but an image of this man in the Holy of Holies. And in fact, the entire world must worship under penalty of death. Exactly what happened in the days of Antiochus. The Jews were slaughtered by the tens of thousands who would not worship an image of Zeus. And in the tribulation, tens of thousands will be slaughtered who will not worship the image of the beast. Revelation 13, an image of this man. He breaks his covenant with the Jews. Daniel 11, verse 30. For ships from Cyprus, probably warships is what is in view. Ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant, the Jews, and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Meaning, if you align with him against the Jews and against the holy covenant, he's going to show regard for you. But if you don't, you're going to be his enemy too. And this is a time that war breaks out all over the globe. Now, I made this observation before, and I'll make this again right here. You have the fourth rider of these four horsemen of the apocalypse. The red horse rider speaks of war. I don't think it's necessarily a coincidence that red is the color of jihad when you study Islam. On 9/11, there was reported from Flight 93 before it went down and those heroic men took back over the plane, realizing what was happening. And as they were on their cell phones talking to AT&T operators, or in some cases their wives, they were reporting that the jihadists were wearing red bandanas. Red being the color of holy war, jihad. You have a red horse. Could it be, in fact, jihad? That's in view here. I don't know. Just a puzzle piece I'm putting together. But what I do know is the fourth horse, the pale horse, is in fact this color right here. And not so coincidentally, I'm convinced that is in fact the color of Islam. Look at what it says in Revelation 6 and verse 7. When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come and see." And so I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him, and power was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and by the beasts of the earth. Could it be the great sword spoken of, related to this red horse, is in fact the sword of Islam, jihad? It's a holy war. I don't know for sure, but I do know this is a pale horse translated from the word coloris in Revelation chapter 6. Coloris being the color green, pale green, which happens to be the color of Islam. If you go anywhere in the world, especially throughout the Islamic world, atop every single mosque is this color right here. Usually a light in the night. A light that is a pale green light that you can see in the darkness of the night. You can see where every mosque is in every Muslim city, because this is the color that you see right there atop every single mosque. I don't know for sure, but I do know whoever he is, he will do what's never been done before. And up to this point in the chapter, it's been both history that prophetically paints a picture of something yet future. But from this point forward, there's no history whatsoever. It's all prophecy. Because you have now someone who proclaims himself to be God, and he will persecute all the true followers of God. And of course, we know this is what happens now as he breaks that peace covenant with Israel. He goes into the temple proclaiming himself to be God. God manifests, verse 31, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. And then they shall take away the daily sacrifices, Daniel 9:27, and place there the abomination of desolation. This is the image of the beast spoken of by John in Revelation chapter 13. What is that image? I don't have time to really explain everything I'd like to here. But that word in Revelation 13, speaking of the image of the beast, is the Greek word icon, from which we get the word icon. It speaks of an exact duplicate, a replicate. John is describing things 2,000 years in the future for which language and words have not been invented. He's using the limits of the language of a first century fisherman. He uses the word icon, translated as image. Historically, it's, the false prophet will set up, I don't know, a robot of some type, a statue of some kind. It says an image of the beast, and the false prophet gives this image the ability to have both breath and to speak. Now, what is interesting about this image in Revelation 13, that now is set up in the holy place, in the sanctuary, the abomination of desolation. It's given breath. It says in Revelation 13, the word is pneuma, breath. But what it doesn't say is it's given life. It's given the ability to breathe, but that's a different word than the word life, Zoe. It speaks of life that God gives. God is the giver of life. It's given breath, but it's not given life. I don't know this for sure, but I'm convinced personally what you have there is a clone. Icon is what John says. What he sees is a clone. Remember Revelation 13, this man receives a deadly head wound. At some point he is assassinated. He receives a mortal head wound. These nations have turned on him. His coalition is breaking up. Some of his alliances are now in rebellion. Somebody successfully assassinates him and he dies. But remember, while Satan can take life, he cannot give life. He cannot give life. He can only take life. What you have here is a counterfeit resurrection. The image of the beast, a clone of this man that is now possessed by Satan. You now have Satan sitting on the throne of God in the temple of God. As Jesus was God incarnate, you now have Satan incarnate, and he is receiving worship from all over the world as a God. Exactly what Satan has always wanted, to sit on the throne of God, to be worshiped as God, and for a short season, that is exactly what he will have. Verses 36 through 45 deal now specifically with the future world ruler known as the Antichrist. He claims to be God, and he'll be supernaturally empowered by other gods. Look at what this says, remarkable, verse 36. Then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of God, speaking of the true and living God. He speaks, remember, he exalts himself against all other gods. This would be the gods of the Hindus, the million gods of the Hindus. This would be the God of Islam, Allah. This would be against every other false god. Remember, look at what it says. He magnifies himself above every god, all the false gods traditionally, of all the false religions, and shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods. That's our God, the true and living God, Yahweh, made known through the Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, if indeed he does first pose as the 12th Imam. This would have to do with the God of Islam, Allah. If I'm wrong about any of that, it would have to do with any of the traditional gods. Let's say the gods of Christians, I should say the God of Christians, the God of Islam, the God of Jews, of the three major world religions. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers nor the desire of women. Very curious phrase there. Don't know for sure what that implies or what that means. I think there's a reason possibly, though, that we're watching the rise of militant homosexuality in our age, in our day. He will not regard the desire of women. This is past the age of tolerance. For a long time, it was tolerance. It's no longer just tolerating those that are LGBTQ. We should tolerate everyone as Christians. We should love everyone unconditionally. We should show everyone regard. We should show people respect and dignity and generosity and hospitality. Matters not their sexuality. That is a core value of Christianity. But at the same time, we've seen this rise of a militant movement in the LGBTQ community, which means it's not enough just for tolerance, it's complete celebration, complete affirmation, and if you don't agree morally with me, we will cancel you, we will come after you. And I would suggest that is part of what Jesus meant when he said, as it was in the days of Lot, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. He was speaking specifically of Sodom and Gomorrah, these two cities of blatant, militant, homosexual immorality and depravity. And for some reason, God thought we needed to know that the Antichrist will regard neither the God of his fathers, speaking of the traditional gods of the traditional religions of human civilization, nor the desire of women. But look at this. Nor regard any God, for he shall exalt himself above them all. But in their place he shall honor a God of fortresses. Who is this God? The King James, it's a God of forces. Here I'm using New King James, a God of fortresses. A God which his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things. Now, if you saw my last lesson on the return of the gods, you know exactly where I'm going with this. In all probability, you have a man that is now empowered by Satan. 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 9 says he has God-like powers, God-like abilities to do signs and wonders. And it would appear that he is in alliance with other God-like beings, gods of fortresses or forces. I would suggest the gods return to affirm this man that has now been deified in the eyes of men and women all over the world. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory. And he shall cause them to rule over many, these foreign gods, and divide the land for gain. The implication is the gods return, not the gods of his father, the God of Christians or the God of Jews or the God of Muslims, but rather foreign gods, the gods from the heavens that come down again to advance human civilization. He appears to be in alliance with them as they endorse him and affirm him as the God that all others should worship. It says they rule over many and divide the land for gain. But in their place, he shall honor a God of fortresses and a God which his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. He will control the world's wealth and monetary system. I want you to notice what it says. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. This man completely controls the globe now because he controls the world's wealth. He controls the world's monetary system. Verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. He shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, speaking of Israel, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand: Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. This would be the modern day country of Jordan, curiously. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. Now, think about this. With the collapse of economies, with the collapse of world currencies, there's only three things that will be of true value, tangible value: gold, silver, and oil. And what you're learning here is he's already peaceably taken over the province and the oily places. Verse 24, he commands the gold and silver and precious things. This man is going to completely be able to control the world economy. And you begin to see why he can impose then upon the world what John says in Revelation 13, he calls the mark of the beast, a world banking system, a common world currency where he can control who gets to buy, who gets to sell, who gets to trade. If you don't have this mark, which amounts to a mark of allegiance to this beast, this man, and his world kingdom, you're completely cut out. You're completely locked out of any ability to buy or sell anything. Yet he will meet his destruction at the Battle of Armageddon. His kingdom will be but for a short season. And this is exactly what happened to Antiochus, God manifest. His kingdom was but for a short season. He would meet a very slow and painful demise. But when it came, it would come quickly. And as it was for Antiochus, it will be for the Antichrist. Daniel 11:40, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots. You're looking now what amounts to historically the military maneuvering of these two ancient kings against each other, the kingdom of Ptolemy and the kingdom of Seleucus. But now in some way, you're looking, I'm convinced, at the maneuvering of the nations toward the battle of Armageddon at the end of the tribulation. With many ships he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Remember what it says in Revelation 9? It tells us that there will be a 200 million man army that will march on him and ultimately converge in the battle of Armageddon. There's really, I don't think, any wonder about what this army is. It's undoubtedly China. Think about China today. China will not submit to a world kingdom. They want to be their own kingdom. You think about North Korea. No way North Korea is playing in this man's sandbox, all right? They will initially submit out of necessity, but they will seize their opportunity to lead a military rebellion against him. And toward the time of the end of the tribulation, this is what happens. The nations begin marching against the forces of the Antichrist, ultimately converging in the battle of Armageddon. That's what you're now reading. News from the east and the north shall trouble him. He hears about this 200 million man army marching toward him, and it begins to trouble him. And you better believe he's troubled. He goes out to meet him. It says in Revelation chapter 16 and verse 12 that the angel pours out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water is dried up, so the kings of the east might be prepared. And that's in some way what you're now reading. He shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. It's not going to end well for him as this angel pours out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, dries up that great river Euphrates, so the kings of the east begin marching toward him. And this 200 million man army, undoubtedly, China represented by that 200 million man army, the only army on earth that can field an army of 200 million men. Undoubtedly, the implication would also be perhaps Iran. Think about it. If indeed he has announced himself to be God, devout Muslims would immediately turn on him. And so that's undoubtedly the news from the east that he's now receiving, that he's now getting. News from the north, who could that be? Russia, possibly. Historically, most commentators relate the news from the north being Russia related to Gog and Magog, Ezekiel chapter 38. You know what? I want you to see that God gives us the chance to live triumphantly, even in the middle of tribulation. I want to close very quickly with this. Daniel 11:32. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. This is speaking of these tribulation saints that are in the middle of this horrible, horrible Holocaust that has been poured out on them. The people that know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits, meaning they're going to be martyred by the masses. And many of them will indeed be beheaded. It tells us in Revelation 20. One more reason to think maybe what you're reading about is Islamic jihad. Jihadists historically behead their enemies. And could there be a clue there in Revelation 20? Possibly. As the jihad is poured out in some way on the masses who don't follow. I don't know for sure, but I do know this will be a time where they that know their God will be strong and carry out great exploits. Yes, They will be martyred by the masses, but they will see God do miracles. And those are the people who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. And some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, to purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. Meaning God is allowing this to happen on these tribulation saints to refine them. Now remember, we the bride of Christ are refined in the fires of the judgment seat of Christ. Not in the tribulation, but the judgment seat of Christ. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 3. We are refined in the fire, which is why Revelation 19 says the bride has made herself ready, and now she's adorned in fine white linen. It defines as the righteousness of the saints. But those that don't go in the rapture, that come to faith in Christ during the tribulation, they are refined in the fires of this horrible Holocaust. God is refining them to make them also white, because it is still for the appointed time. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, speaking of the Daniel 9:27 covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. Number one, they're going to be fearless. And no, I don't think we're going through the tribulation if you're listening to me right now, but I cannot promise we won't go through any tribulation. Church, we need to be prepared for persecution. We need to be prepared for tribulation. We need to be fearless, as these tribulation saints will be fearless. They will absolutely be faithful. They will be faithful to the end. They will love not their life even unto death. God promises in the end we win. Why can we be fearless? Why can we be faithful? Because we know how it's going to end. And in the end, righteousness will win. We may lose some battles along the way. And these tribulation saints, many are going to lose their life. Revelation 12:11, though, it says this: they overcame him, Satan, by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives even unto death. And I would suggest that is the same formula for our success in whatever tribulation we face. Even if it's not the 7-year tribulation, there's going to be times we're going to face persecution. There's times we're going to face lots of tribulation. How do we overcome? By the blood of the Lamb. That is our positional reality. We have victory already by the word of their testimony. This has to do with the promises of God that he has made for you. And the word of testimony. In other words, we refused to embrace a lie and we walk in the truth of what God has said, no matter what we see. And it says, they love not their life even unto death. It's about learning to completely surrender all rights of our life, to give all rights to the Lord Jesus Christ. See, when you've surrendered all you have nothing left that anyone can take away from you. When you've already given your life to Jesus Christ, you can no longer lose your life because you've already given it away. See, that is why these tribulation saints are going to be fearless. They're going to do great exploits. And they're going to be faithful, even unto death. And that's exactly what God is calling all of us now to do. If it feels like we're not winning, it's because God hasn't yet brought the ending. Because I'll promise, in the end, we win. Live fearlessly and live faithfully to the end. Because one day soon, we're going to see Jesus. Soon and very soon, we're going to see the King. Guys, I love you a lot. I know that is a lot at you to process right now. That's why you get to hit pause or rewind. There's a lot there to cover. And I'm so glad that you're going through this journey with me through the book of Daniel. God bless you. I'll see you soon.